Willkommen zu unserem 6. Talk Europe mit Chantal Mouffe, Peter Pilz und Robert Pfaller. Mein Name ist René Schröder, ich bin die Obfrau vom Bildungsverein Offene Gesellschaft. Das ist die politische Akademie von jetzt, liest der Pilz. Und bevor ich an Robert Pfaller übergebe, möchte ich gerne noch Werbung machen für unsere nächsten Veranstaltungen. Der Verein Offene Gesellschaft organisiert offene Salons, die würde ich Ihnen sehr ans Herz legen. Das sind kleinere Veranstaltungen, wo es sehr in die Tiefe geht. Und am 15. Mai haben wir Ingrid Leber-Vasseur. Das ist das friedliche Gesicht von den Gilets jaunes, eine sensationelle Frau. Also warten Sie auf den offenen Salon, 15. Mai. Mit dem 6. Talk Europe hören wir auf für jetzt, aber im Herbst wird es weitergehen. Da haben wir weitere Stars, die kommen, die Svenja Flassböhler und Uli Brandt. Also bleiben Sie dran. Und ich möchte mich auch bedanken bei Robert Pfaller, der hat die ganze Talk Europe-Liste, die in meinen Augen wirklich, wirklich toll war, begleitet, organisiert und inhaltlich sozusagen schön in eine logische Linie gebracht. Und er wird die heutige Veranstaltung begleiten. Dankeschön.
Ja, schönen guten Abend. Vielen Dank, René Schröder, für die freundlichen Worte. Mein Name ist Robert Pfaller. Ich bin vom Bildungsverein eingeladen worden, zusammen mit meiner Agentin Alexandra Oetzlinger von der Agentur Oetzlinger diese Veranstaltungsreihe zu konzipieren und zu organisieren. Unsere Idee war, dass wir hier eine Auswahl an Theoretikerinnen und Theoretikern präsentieren, die in der Lage sind, längerfristige, nicht unbedingt tagespolitische Fragen zu stellen, aber Fragen, die genau die neuralgischen Punkte der Europapolitik, aber auch der nationalen Politik betreffen. Und zwar jene Fragen, von denen wir glauben, dass die Linke nicht über sie schweigen darf, weil sonst ein Unbehagen entsteht oder eine sprachlose Wut, der dann nur die Rechte eine Sprache verleiht, aber eben eine ganz andere Sprache. Und deshalb haben wir diejenigen Theoretikerinnen und Theoretikerinnen versucht einzuladen, die hier radikale und grundsätzliche Fragen stellen an den Punkten, an denen zuletzt die größten Unzufriedenheiten entstanden sind in Europa. Wir hatten zunächst Bill Mitchell und Thomas Fazi, die nachgedacht haben in einer sehr grundsätzlichen Weise darüber, wie man eigentlich wieder so etwas wie eine keynesianische Politik in Europa herstellen könnte. Eine Politik, die in den ersten 3 Jahrzehnten nach dem Krieg für zunehmende Gleichheit und für Chancen gesorgt hat, in einer Weise, die heute schon fast utopisch ist. Also wenn man heute das fordert, was in den 70er Jahren selbstverständlich war, wird man schon als linker Spinner abgetan. So haben sich die Verhältnisse verändert und die ökonomischen Grundlagen dafür haben Mitchell und Fazi sehr gut dargestellt. Dann hatten wir Slavoj Žižek mit der Frage nach den Institutionen, die notwendig wären, um die Veränderungen zu erreichen, die wir hier brauchen. Catherine Millet hat die Frage nach einer Politik der Befindlichkeiten und der Diktatur des Gefühlten gestellt. Eine Frage, die auch in Österreich eine große Resonanz hatte und die Liste Pilz beinahe gekillt hätte in einem bestimmten Moment. Und zuletzt hatten wir Frank Furedi, der eigentlich das Thema schon eröffnet hat, das auch heute uns betreffen wird. Furedi, englischer Soziologe, der sich sehr stark auch mit Bildungspolitik beschäftigt hat und mit der Frage, wie die britischen Universitäten sich verändert haben durch die Reformen der letzten Jahrzehnte und der auch die Frage nach der Entdemokratisierung in Europa gestellt hat und der Frage nach der Angst vor dem Volk, also einem Volk, das zum Beispiel für Brexit votet. Das war unser letztes Thema und das schließt eigentlich direkt an das Thema des heutigen Abends, das Chantal Mouffe präsentieren wird unter dem Titel The Future of Democracy in a Post-Political Age. Der heutige Abend wird in englischer Sprache stattfinden. Sie können aber später in der Diskussion, das haben wir so vereinbart, wenn Sie lieber Deutsch fragen möchten, wenn Sie langsam und deutlich sprechen, auch auf Deutsch Fragen stellen, dann können die auch beantwortet werden und notfalls werden wir uns bemühen, sie zu übersetzen. Ich werde nur zur Einstimmung eben noch ein paar Worte auf Deutsch sagen. Chantal Mouffe ist vielen von Ihnen wahrscheinlich bekannt durch ihre weit verbreiteten und aufsehenerregenden Publikationen. Zuletzt hat sie das Buch verfasst für einen linken Populismus bei Surkamp erschienen letztes Jahr. Davor gab es 2014 Agonistik, die Welt politisch denken, 2008 das demokratische Paradoxon, davor über das Politische, wieder die kosmopolitische Illusion, und eines ihrer berühmtesten Bücher gemeinsam mit Ernesto Laclau war 1985 das Buch Hegemonie und radikale Demokratie. Chantal Mouffe wird heute wieder sprechen mit einem Politiker. Peter Pilz hat sich bereit erklärt, hier als Diskutant aufzutreten. Ich glaube, das ist auch ein Merkmal und ein Alleinstellungsmerkmal dieser Veranstaltungsreihe, dass es hier tatsächlich zustande kommt, dass intellektuelle und verantwortliche Politiker aufeinander hören und Argumente austauschen. Ich sage vielleicht noch zum Verständnis ein Wort zur Theorie von Chantal Mouffe. Zwei Begriffe sind vielleicht nützlich kurz zu erläutern. Erstens der Begriff des Politischen. Chantal Mouffe stützt sich hier, was für eine linke Theoretikerin ungewöhnlich ist, auf die Theorie des rechten deutschen Philosophen Carl Schmitt und seinen Begriff des Politischen. Carl Schmitt hat die Auffassung vertreten, dass das Politische gekennzeichnet ist durch einen grundsätzlichen Gegensatz zwischen wir und sie. Also dort, wo das nicht da ist, wo kein wir gegen sie steht, findet nach Schmitt eine Entpolitisierung statt. Diesen Grundgedanken hat Chantal Mouffe aufgenommen und ihn in einen eigenen Begriff übertragen. Ein Begriffspaar eigentlich, das ist das Paar Agonismus und Antagonismus. Der Antagonismus ist sozusagen die wilde Form, die unzivilisierte Form des Gegensatzes. Der Agonismus wäre diese Form, wo ein Interessenskonflikt repräsentiert und unter Verfahrensregeln auch ausgetragen werden kann. Und das hat zur Folge, also unter dieser Voraussetzung wird klar, eine These, die Chantal Mouffe in den letzten Büchern vertreten hat, nämlich, dass immer dort, wo der Agonismus unterbleibt, seine wilde, böse Schwester, der Antagonismus, hervortritt. Dort, wo also zum Beispiel durch sehr lange große Koalitionen bestimmte Interessenskonflikte keine politische Repräsentanz gefunden haben, dort kommt es dazu, dass dann so Parteien plötzlich auftauchen, die eigentlich unwählbar erscheinen oder die man nicht zum 3. Bundestagspräsidenten wählen kann und so weiter. Überall dort, wo also keine geregelte Repräsentanz bestimmter Interessen und Interessenskonflikte stattfinden kann, sagt Chantal Mouffe, dort tritt der wilde Antagonismus hervor. Und ich glaube, das wäre auch vielleicht ein Punkt, den man hier bedenken kann. Genau das ist eigentlich auch ein Grundgedanke unserer Vortragsreihe hier. Wir haben hier versucht, dem Agonismus einen Raum zu öffnen, unterschiedlichen gegensätzlichen Ansichten eine Diskussionsmöglichkeit zu eröffnen, um zu vermeiden, dass alles im blinden Antagonismus endet, wo man sich nur noch als Rassisten, Sexisten oder sonst irgendwas beschimpft. Das wäre unser Beitrag zum Versuch, die Kräfteverhältnisse im Land zu ändern, indem wir das Niveau der politischen Debatte ein Stück weit zu heben versuchen. Vielen Dank, damit bin ich am Ende meiner Erläuterungen. Madame Mouffe, merci beaucoup d'être venue. Vielen Dank, dass Sie gekommen sind. Thank you very much for attending us and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Let me see.
Not yet. Can we do something?
Because I've pushed that. Okay. Danke. Always technical problem. Okay. Good evening. Thank you very much, Robert Pfaller, for the introduction. It's always a pleasure to speak in. Is that okay? No? Ah. Better? Yes? You can hear at the very back, yes? Okay, good, perfect then. But in that case, I need to put that in here, okay. Okay. So when we envisage the present state of democracy, one of the assertions that we often come across is that our current condition is one of post-democracy. The meaning conveyed by this notion of post-democracy is that modern democracies, while maintaining the facade of formal democratic principle, are increasingly controlled by privileged elites. The implementation of neoliberal policies have led to the colonization of the state by corporate interests, and crucial political decisions are now taken outside the traditional democratic channels. This is at the origin of the loss of legitimacy of democratic institutions, which manifests itself in two ways. On one side, the growing phenomenon of depoliticization, growing abstention in election, but also, and that is more recent, and this precisely the phenomenon that I'm going to concentrate on, the development of protest movement that put into question this post-democratic situation, but they can put it into question from, and they are usually called, of course, populist, but they can take, those forms of resistances can be articulated in two different ways. And this is where the difference that I established between right-wing populism and left-wing populism. But I'm not yet quite there. In my book On the Political, published in 2005, I have examined the reason for what I call the post-political approach. Don't mix post-democratic with post-political, because the post-political is one of the phenomena of the post-democratic, but the two things don't mean exactly the same thing. The post-democratic is, in fact, something that include post-politics and also a phenomenon more economic, because post-politics is something that happened in politics. And by the way, I want to clarify, because there have been many misunderstandings. By speaking of post-politics, I'm not saying that we move now in a new stage in which there is no more politics. In fact, I use that in a very critical way. It's not something that I think, it's not a temporal evolution. I think it's something that we should resist, because it's, of course, not good for democracy, this post-political situation. And of course, that has become dominant in liberal democratic societies, and this is what I examine On the Political. And there I argue that this post-political situation is linked to the move toward the center, which in the last decade has been the strategy of social democratic parties in Europe. A strategy which, under the motto of the third way, first, of course, elaborated by New Labour in Britain by Anthony Giddens, theoretically, and put into practice by Tony Blair. So this is something this, I think, just a second. I link very closely politics and post the third way. Oh my goodness. According to this post-political approach, Western societies have entered a second stage of modernity. That's the thesis of Giddens. Also by the way, we find that in Germany with Ulrich Beck. A stage of what they call reflexive modernization, where the adversarial model of politics, which they say was characteristic only of the first stage of modernization, what they call simple modernization, has become obsolete. Giddens claims that it is not necessary to think beyond left and right. In fact, one of his books is called Beyond Left and Right, and to envisage a new type of politics of the supposedly radical center, which transcends the old-fashioned divide between left and right. Well, such a view, as I was saying, just elaborated first in Britain, was later adopted by other socialist and social democratic parties, which began to present themselves as being center-left. That's a move towards the center of social democratic parties. Under the pretense of modernizing the social democratic project, because they say we need to adapt it to a globalized world, center-left parties, in fact, they were capitulated to neoliberalism. Convinced that there was no alternative to the current form of globalized financial capitalism, they accepted the framework that was in fact established by neoliberal hegemony. That was very clear in Britain, because when Tony Blair came to power, it did not challenge at all the hegemony that had been established by Margaret Thatcher, but simply proposed to humanize it a little bit, a bit more redistribution. But he said there is no alternative to neoliberal globalization. So having abandoned any attempt to challenge the existing relation of power, to challenge neoliberalism, those social democratic parties now limit themselves to propose ways, as I was saying, to humanize neoliberal globalization. And of course, this is why their politics are to distinguish from those of the center-right parties. There is this some kind of consensus at the center between center-right and center-left, precisely on the idea that there is no alternative to neoliberal globalization. It seems to me that in the discussion about post-democracy, the role played by this post-political situation is not sufficiently taken into account. Because usually the people who speak of post-democracy, in fact the term was coined first by Colin Crouch, a British sociologist, they insist particularly on the economic aspect. And I think, of course, it is important to grasp the transformation of the capitalist system, which have provided the economic condition for the success of neoliberal globalization. But that does not automatically explain the reason for the disappearance of a vibrant democratic debate among the different ways in which social relation and public institution could be organized, what I call precisely the post-political. And this is where I think that the responsibility of left parties need to be recognized. And I think this is something, no, it's beginning to be acknowledged, but during a long time it was not interesting, and certainly not in the first theorization about post-democracy. By failing to acknowledge that politics is intrinsically partisan, and that democratic politics require what I call an agonistic debate among conflicting projects, and a choice between real alternatives, the consensual politics of the third way is in fact contributed to the disaffection with politics, which is at the core of our post-democratic condition. When citizens feel that they cannot ever say in the fundamental decision which concern their common affair, and that political questions are dealt by experts because they are considered to be of a technical nature, and that is very clear. Of course, if you believe that there is no alternative to neoliberal globalization, then it means that real political decisions can't take place. Political decisions are in fact technical issues, and if they are technical issues, it's of course better to be dealt by experts. And this is something which is very quite important in what politics is seen by many social democratic parties. So this, of course, explains why democratic institutions have been emptied of their substance and why their legitimacy is increasingly being threatened. Elections are reduced to providing a rubber stamp for measures imposed by a variety of actors whose interests are not publicly accountable, and the democratic process, in fact, loses its raison d'être. To be sure, societies still claim to be democratic, but what is the meaning of democracy in our post-political times? Well, this is a problem that I have examined in my book, The Democratic Paradox, where I brought to the fore that there existed a tension between what I call the two ethico-political principles of liberal democracy. The liberal democracy understood our model of democracy, the Western model, because we need to understand that when we speak of democracy here in Europe, we refer to a very specific model, which is liberal democracy. And liberal democracy, in fact, should be understood as the articulation between two different traditions. On one side, the liberal tradition of the rule of law, individual rights, democratic, and on the other side, the democratic tradition of popular sovereignty. The Canadian political theorist C.B. Macpherson has shown how this articulation between the liberal tradition and the democratic tradition is in fact something that was established during the 19th century, when liberalism was democratized and democracy was liberalized. So here it's important to realize that it's not something that is absolutely necessary. It's a contingent articulation which took place in a specific historical moment. And that, I think, is something that Macpherson shows very clearly. But so we see, the influence of democracy, both liberalism and democracy, but it's important to realize that there always was a tension between the exigencies of liberty and the exigencies of equality. A tension which, in fact, have provided the dynamic of the confrontation. In fact, we can say this is what the struggle between left and right is about. In fact, Norberto Bobbio is in a nice little book called Left and Right Shown, that in fact, the main difference between liberalism and democracy is that the Democrats always privilege equality and the other one privilege liberty and accept inequality. So we can say that the history of democratic politics can be visualized in terms of a struggle between those two principles for the predominance of one over the other. In some period, the liberal aspect was dominant, in other it was the democratic one. But, and this is what's important, the contestation always remained open. So there was this agonistic debate between those two principles. What has happened under the current hegemony of neoliberalism is that the liberal component, and of course reinterpreted in a particular way which is typical of neoliberalism, has become so dominant that the democratic aspect has almost disappeared. In fact, when you speak the national sovereignty, people say, but that's completely obsolete, democracy is now understood simply in terms of the rule of law, defense of human rights, and the idea of popular sovereignty has been left aside. Those who resist the rule of the elites and insist on the need to give a voice to the people, so those who fight against post-democracy, and those who say, no, but those demands are legitimate, they are today dismissed as being populist. And of course, this, for many people is just something completely, it means you are populist, you are against democracy, you are something that is the enemy for the center-right and the center-left. Well, in my view, this displacement of the democratic tradition by the liberal one, and this is, of course, what has happened, is one of the main features of our post-democratic condition. And it is clearly visible also in the abandon by center-left parties of the struggle for equality. Because for me, the democratic tradition is basically around the pillar of equality and popular sovereignty. But today, the main slogan of center-right, center-left parties are about choice, fairness, equity, inclusion, but they take pains to avoid speaking of equality, because they consider that the idea of equality is too tainted by the equalitarianism of the socialist ideal that they have repudiated. Deprived of the vocabulary that constituted the backbone of its vision of society, it's therefore not surprising that the left is not able to envisage an alternative to neoliberal globalization. And so that's what I understand by a situation of post-democracy. Well, during the first period, most of the resistances against the post-democratic consensus came from the side of right-wing populist parties. In many countries, by drawing a political frontier in a populist way, that between the people and the establishment. Because the political frontier, basically, there are two ways to establish it. Well, first, liberalism, there is no political frontier. But when you draw a political frontier, it can be done in the Marxist socialist traditional way, capital versus labor, or it can be done in a populist way, and that is the division between the people from below and people from above, the people against the establishment. So this is basically the two main differences in which the political frontier can be established. And what has been interesting in recent time is the way in which the reaction, the resistances against post-democracy has manifested itself under the construction of a frontier between the people, those from above, and the people from above the establishment. In drawing this political frontier between the people and the establishment, right-wing populist parties have articulated the demand of the popular sector, which were ignored by the parties of center, center-right, and center-left, because, of course, they were incompatible with the neoliberal project. So that's what, in the first stage, we've seen the development of those right-wing populist parties. But no, in fact, since, I would say, 2011, more or less, we are in a different conjuncture, because the anti-establishment discourse also comes from the progressive side. And some political frontier on the left, reacting against post-politics, are also drawing a frontier between the people and the establishment, which, of course, in the case of left populism, the establishment is clearly designed as being the oligarchy, those who are in control of the main center of economic power. So this is why in my last book, for left populism, I argue that we are today in the populist moment. So we've got populist resistances both from the left and both from the right. What's at stake in this populist moment is how the resistances to post-democracy are going to be articulated and how the people is going to be constructed. Because there are many ways in which these people can be constructed. And here, of course, one something that needs to be established, the people is not an empirical referent. When we speak of the people, it's not the people, that's the population, the empirical referent. The people is always a political category, and it's always politically constructed. So it can be constructed in different ways. And this is what's at stake today. Because not all populist construction of the political frontier have got egalitarian objective. Even when the rejection of the existing system is made in the name of giving back the power to the people. This is, in fact, we must see that it's always in the name of democracy that the populists organize. But of course, it can be articulated differently. Both types of populism aim to federate unsatisfied demand, but they do it in very different ways. The difference lies in the composition of the we and in how the adversary, the they, is going to be defined. Right-wing populism claim that they will bring back popular sovereignty and restore democracy, but this sovereignty is understood as national sovereignty and reserved for those who are deemed to be the true nationals. Right-wing populists do not address the demand for equality, and they construct a people which exclude numerous categories, usually, of course, immigrants. And because they see the immigrants as a threat to the identity and the prosperity of the nation. In fact, right-wing populism, we could say, is a form of politics of immunization, against the defensive one. Their victory could lead to nationalistic, authoritarian form of neoliberalism that, in the name of recovering democracy, will in fact drastically restrict democracy. The objective of a left populism, on the contrary, is of course also to recover democracy, fight against post-democracy, but in this case is to deepen and extend democracy. The social democratic parties, who in many countries have played an important role in the implementation of neoliberal policies, are of course completely unable to grasp the nature of this populist movement. And I think that's one of the problems today. There are all those parties, they say, no, they don't want to examine really what is the origin of this populist wave. And of course, it means that they are not able to face the challenge that they represent. They cannot recognize that many of the demands articulated by right-wing populists, articulated, of course, in xenophobic vocabulary, but those are originally democratic demands to which a progressive answer must be given. So we can't just dismiss those demands. We must try to give a progressive answer to them. Classifying right-wing populist parties as extreme right or neo-fascist, which of course is usually the case, or attributing their lack of their success to a lack of education is of course very convenient for the forces of the center-left. It's an easy way to disqualify them without recognizing the center-left responsibility in such an emergence. And because the center-left has abandoned the popular sector, that those popular sectors have been susceptible of their demand being articulated by right-wing populists. To stop the rise of right-wing populist parties, it is necessary to design a properly political answer through a collective will that will federate all the democratic struggle against post-democracy, recognizing the democratic nucleus that is at the origin of many of those demands. A left populist approach should try to provide a different vocabulary in order to orientate those demands towards egalitarian objectives. Of course, I do not deny that they are among the voters for right-wing populist parties people who feel perfectly at home with their reactionary value. But I'm also convinced that there are others that are attracted to those parties because they feel that those parties are the only ones that care about their problems. And I believe that if a different language is made available, many people who vote for right-wing populist parties might experience their situation in a different way and join the progressive struggle. So I could, in the discussion, if you want, give you some example of that happening. For instance, in the case of France, with Jean-Luc Mélenchon, it's quite interesting to see how in the last election in 2017, he was able to win in an area which had been dominated by Marine Le Pen. So now the question I want to address is, so this kind of left populism, I mean, what kind of politics is that? I think that it's clear that the strategy of left populism seeks the establishment of a new hegemonic order within the constitutional liberal democratic framework. I want to insist on that. And it does not aim at a radical break with pluralist liberal democracy. I don't know, I mean, if we discussed that with Slavoj Žižek, but obviously it's a point in which we've got a profound disagreement. And it does not require the foundation of a totally new political order. It is on the mode of what we could call an immanent critique of the liberal democratic regime that a left populist strategy intervene to challenge post-democracy and to restore the centrality of democratic values of equality and popular sovereignty in order to radicalize them. Such a mode of intervention is possible because despite their relegation by neoliberalism, democratic values still play a significant role in the political imaginary of our societies. And I believe that their critical meaning can be reactivated to subvert the hegemonic order created by neoliberalism and to create a different one. I really want to insist on the fact that to inscribe the left populist strategy in the democratic tradition is decisive. It's really, I will argue, the decisive move, because this establishes a connection with the political value that are central to popular aspiration. I mean, popular aspiration, they don't dream of socialism. I mean, they dream of, having democracy realized. And I think that the fact that so many of the resistances against various forms of oppression are expressed in a democratic, as democratic demand, testify to the crucial role played by the signifier democracy in the political imaginary. I just want to give an example. For instance, the movement of the indignados in Spain, they did not express at all their demand in socialist way. Their motto was democracia real ya. We need a real democracy ya today. Jetzt, which is the name of the party that to which many people here belongs. So I mean that for me it shows that basically what moves people, despite of all the neoliberal ideological attack, is the value of democracy. And I believe that when used critically, emphasizing its egalitarian dimension, the signifier democracy constitutes a powerful weapon in the hegemonic struggle to create a new common sense. What is at stake there in strategy of left populism? It's an hegemonic strategy that engages with the existing political institution in view of transforming them through democratic procedure. It rejects the false dilemma between reform and revolution and is clearly different both from the revolutionary strategy of what is called, I don't like the term, but the extreme left, and from the sterile reformism of the social liberals, social democracy, which basically is social liberalism. Because those, in fact, they only seek an alternation in government without really transforming the relation of power. And this is why I propose to call this strategy a strategy of radical reformism, to indicate the subversive dimension of the reform and the fact that what they pursue, although it is through democratic means, is a profound transformation of the structure of the socio-economic power relation. In fact, there is a term that we find in the work of the French sociologist André Gorz, which some of you might know, which is quite interesting because he speaks of non-reformist reform. Reform which aim is not just pure reformation, but transformation. Well, this is what I understand by radical reformism. The objective of a less populist strategy is the creation of a popular majority to come to power and to establish a new hegemonic formation. The challenge it faces is how are we, these people, this collective will, this we that it need to be created, how is it going to be created? And I think it's clear that it needs to be around a project which addresses the diverse form of subordination. There's a very heterogeneous set of demands. They are in fact issues concerning exploitation, certainly, and the demand of the working class, traditional working class are still important, but there are also demands concerning domination or discrimination. The question of racism, sexism, and so all those democratic demands need to be articulated. This requires, of course, reasserting the importance of the social question, which, it's true, been in many cases left aside. I mean, I know that a book which has been having a lot of success here in Austria and also in Germany is a book by Didier Ribon, Retour à Reims, where he precisely, show how, I mean, I can't enter into the argument, and you probably know about it, but the fact that the social question is being abandoned by the left is something which explains why, in his family and the people that he used to live when he was young, which were all communists, they all vote for National Front. I think that is very important to re-establish the importance of the social question. And of course, that needs to be done taking account of the increasing fragmentation and the diversity of the workers, but also the specificity of the various other democratic demands, demand of feminism, anti-racism, LGBT, all those demands. I want to insist that a special emphasis must be given to a question that has gained particular relevance in the last 30 years, and which in fact is of a special urgency today. It is, of course, the future of the planet, the ecological dimension. It is impossible to envisage a project of radicalization of democracy in which the ecological question is not at the center of the agenda. And I think it's quite interesting to see, I mean, I don't know what the situation in Austria, but in Britain we had the Extinction Rebellion, and in fact in many other countries there is the strike of the high school student. So this is really something which is now becoming totally at the center of the agenda. And I think it is therefore essential to combine the ecological question with the social question. of course, it's not going to be easy, but I believe that an ambitious and well-designed ecological project that articulate the question of social question could offer an attractive vision of the future democratic society that might entice some sectors which are currently within the neoliberal hegemonic bloc. Because one argument, sometimes people say, society divided between the winner of neoliberal globalization and the loser. And of course, you can't just address the loser, you also need to get some of the winner on your side. Is that possible? Well, I do believe that, in fact, this is possible through precisely an ecological project. Because a project of radicalization of democracy, according precisely to this view, articulation of the ecological and social question, could appeal to constituencies which so far have not been identified with the left, to some of the winners of neoliberal globalization. Because those winners, of course, they could say, well, my situation is very okay, I mean, I have no problem, but they've got children, and they've got grandchildren, and so they might also wonder, what kind of future there is for their children and grandchildren if, one does not put a stop to the destruction of the neoliberal model. So I think that, from that point of view, it's possible that they, to an adequate hegemonic politics, could be recruited for a progressive alternative. To finish, I want to emphasize that the objective of a left populist strategy is not the establishment of a populist regime. I mean, populism is not, according to the way in which I am here using it, and of course, which has been theorized by Ernesto Laclau in his book on populist reason. He insists populism is a strategy of construction of political frontier, is not an ideology, is not a regime. So I think it's of course important to understand what I mean when I mean populism. So it's not populist regime with a predefined program. What is at stake is to bring about a new hegemonic formation that will foster the recovery and deepening of democracy. So what is really at stake is radicalization of democracy. This hegemonic formation, this radicalization of democracy, will take different shape according to the specific trajectories involved and to the different countries. It's not going to be a model that is going to be applied the same everywhere. It could be envisaged. Some people speak, for instance, I argue in my book that the strategy of Jeremy Corbyn is a strategy of left populism, and in fact, the Corbynites agree with that. If not, I would not have dared to defend this thesis. But of course, what they say is that their objective is to establish, through this populist strategy, a democratic socialism. Jean-Luc Mélenchon prefers to speak of eco-socialism. Some other people prefer to speak of associative democracy, participatory democracy. So this, you see, it's not one specific regime. It's a particular form in which radicalization of democracy is going to be understood. And that depends very much on specific context and national tradition. So the chain of equivalence through which the people is going to be constituted, because this is how, when I speak of chain of equivalence, it's a concept that we develop in hegemonic socialist strategies, how all those heterogeneous demands, are going to be articulated. Of course, that is going to depend on historical circumstances, and the dynamics of left populist strategy cannot be understood, in isolation from contextual reference. There is no blueprint for how this will take place, and there is no final destination. What's important, whatever the name, is the recognition that democracy is the hegemonic signifier around which the diverse struggles are going to be articulated in a left populist strategy, and that the institution of political liberalism are not discarded. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chantal Mouffe, for this very inspiring and mind-opening presentation. I noticed that maybe I should explain two of your crucial concepts that you were applying. One concept is the concept of articulation. In the German understanding, articulation is what we do when we utter language through our mouth and give it clear signifiers. But in the more Latin French tradition, articulation is something that is a kind of mechanical relationship between links. So how articulation is a way of how mechanical flexible elements are tied together. So if you put a couple of children's swings after each other and press on one, the next will go up, and so the next swing will swing into the opposite direction and so on. So this is the sense of how Louis Althusser, for example, used the notion of articulation. It means of connecting elements that are in themselves flexible, but through their connection get a certain efficiency. And so what Chantal Mouffe is pointing at is that we have very often to do with flexible elements in political life. For example, a kind of widespread rage or anger in the population without that being necessarily a kind of fascist or anti-democratic anger. Only under the condition that this is connected and linked to some other flexible element, like the notion of the nation or the notion of we against the immigrants, this anger gets a certain articulation that gives it a certain political direction or certain political efficiency. But under a different articulation, if we could link it, for example, to a signifier like democracy, this anger could shift into an opposite direction. And this is, so just to briefly explain the other concept that you were referring to, what in the Marxist tradition has been called hegemony. So those who provide the element that gives the direction to this flexible anger are those who establish hegemony, which means in German Führerschaft or leadership, as you can say. So I think this is very important here to emphasize, to understand the theoretical structure of what you were pointing at. And I think in terms of content, it is very important that you reminded us that things are far less flexible than they may appear in the current situation. This is also especially what you pointed out when you mentioned the book by Didier Eribon, Rückkehr nach Reims heißt das Buch auf Deutsch von Didier Eribon, where Eribon shows very clearly that today people are passionately voting for the extreme right in France, but it is precisely people who like 10, 15, 20 years ago were always voting for the Communist Party in France. So it is in a way the same popular anger that can be articulated to a rightist signifier or to a rightist slogan as well as to a leftist slogan.
Yeah, but he insists that the reason is because there is no social democrat. Well, in the case of France, the Socialist Party is abandoned. It does not try even to establish a discourse for those people. You know, it's not simply that it is also. I mean, Didier Eribon insists very much on the responsibility of the socialists in this. Huh?
Exactly. Yes. So that leads also maybe to my first question. In order to enter this struggle.
So are we going to move, because if you are going to ask me question or what about the, I want to know if I go on here or if I move there.
Well, we do not know what you still have in your pocket, but please act as the way you feel comfortable.
No, in that case, okay. When Peter Pilz comes here, then
then
I
you can.
Move. Okay.
Yeah. So maybe I start with two basic questions that may have arisen here. If we want to give this widespread anger that is to be felt in Austria, but also in France and elsewhere, if we want to give it a slogan, or to give it, as you call it, a signifier, in order to oppose the rightist articulation, in order to fight the rightist hegemony, is it not necessary to at least express the discontent that is at work in this anger? So the rightists have succeeded in expressing discontent, and that was exactly what the big coalitions have always avoided. They were always voices of quieting the people, of keeping them silent and saying, "Oh, we are so fine in Austria, please shut up and see how fine we are." So, and the rightists somehow appealed to the people just because they expressed anger. And so is the question not also that the left must find words of anger, finally, which the Social Democrats have not been finding for like 30 years now? And secondly, what would it mean to find words of anger with regard to European politics? What would that mean in order to have a kind of political strategy within the European Union? Is it enough to democratize the European Union, or would it be necessary in certain cases, as for example Bill Mitchell has argued, to withdraw from the European Union in order to regain, for example, monetary sovereignty that is a condition for a new Keynesian economic politics? So what would democracy in Europe, in your sense, really mean?
Well, I'm going to tell you that I'm not sure about the second question, but the first one, well, in fact, I'm going to give you an example. I'm not quite sure I would put it in terms of to find a word of anger. Is against whom the existing anger need to be directed. I was saying in my presentation that in France, for instance, there's been Jean-Luc Mélenchon and the people from La France Insoumise have been able to win to win back, let's say, people who voted for Marine Le Pen, because there is this debate in France, particularly a debate that which has been raised by Eric Fassin, who has published a book, Le Populisme, le Grand Ressentiment, the Big Resentment, where he argues that the left should not even be concerned with the people that vote for Marine Le Pen. He said because we should simply give them up. Those people are intrinsically, necessarily homophobe, sexist, racist. So those are, it's something that there is no way in which we are going to be able to make them change their mind. So let's forget about that. And he said what the strategy of the left should be to try to win back the people who are abstentionists. Okay. And the book was published before the last election in France. He was, for instance, saying that it's unthinkable that somebody who voted for Marine Le Pen will not vote for Jean-Luc Mélenchon. This is completely false because it has been shown in the last election that they were, not incredibly important sector, of course, but significant sector of the people who voted for Marine Le Pen, who voted for Jean-Luc Mélenchon, or for instance, there are two very specific cases which are very clear. For instance, in Marseille, Jean-Luc Mélenchon was a candidate, in Marseille, and he was elected in a constituency, a ward that was basically dominated by the Rassemblement National, previously called Front National. So people really, switched up. And another case, which is also very interesting, is the case of Amiens, where François Ruffin, with also somebody from La France Insoumise, won also in an area. When he presented himself as a candidate, people say no chance. It's completely dominated by Marine Le Pen. Particularly Amiens and Picardy is an area where disindustrialized, completely, lot of really very, very difficult economic conditions, and have been abandoned, of course, by the socialists, and Marine Le Pen is very strong. Well, I tell you what François Ruffin did. And of course, La France Insoumise was criticized by, when they began their campaign, was criticized by the left in general, and of course by Eric Fassin, for going to speak with those fascists, you know. Why do you go speak? By the way, that's exactly the same reaction that happened with the Gilets jaunes, you know, because the certain type of, no, we should not even go with Gilets jaunes because there are some people from le Rassemblement National who are there. So like like if you know they've got some kind of contagious disease, we should not, you know, go next to them, you know. Okay, so but it shows you the very specific conception of the a certain type of left. But so François Ruffin went and he went speaking with those people who voted for Marine Le Pen, and began to realize that and trying to understand, you know, what are your problems, and he was telling me that during the discussion, he began to it was quite interesting. He said, "Oh, we saw people evolving, not all of them, of course, but for instance, because those people, when they express their concern, they say, well, you know, we've been abandoned, and the Marine Le Pen was, and Le Front National, were the only ones who were going to speak with them to try to understand what were the problems. And they come to tell, yes, you know, we understand, we've got a... But you see, it's the immigrants. It's because the immigrants that you... So their colère, their anger was given as the immigrants, you know, directed to us. And of course, you know, if the only discourse available for those people is to say, it's the immigrants which are responsible of your situation, obviously they believe that. But Ruffin, through the discussion, managed to discuss and show them that it was not the immigrants, it was the big transnational corporation, because, for instance, particularly in the area where is something where for Arnaud and LV, the luxury things, you know, they've been delocalized, a lot of things. In fact, it's very clear in that case that is the transnational corporation which are responsible for the situation there. And by discussing with people, you know, he make them say, no, but you know, remember, for instance, Bernard Arnault, he's the one who moved this thing. And he say that, for instance, through the discussion, you know, I saw them changing their mind. You know, they were saying, for instance, yeah, you've got a point here. And many of them say, you're right, I'm going to vote for you. You know, so it shows you all an anger that was through certain discourse directed against the immigrant. What's important is to direct that anger towards, you know, another adversary. You know, and I think that's is how I would. So I wouldn't think of not finding the word of anger, but simply trying to understand articulate them towards another thing. So that's my answer to your first question. The EU. Honestly, I mean, I've not been able to make up my mind about that. And by the way, I was in recent months several times invited to take part in France, because in Britain, obviously, not a big topic. Programs about the EU, and I have always declined, because I confess here, I think, you know, situation is very complex, because obviously really existing Europe is a neoliberal Europe, and of course the kind of program anti-austerity things that a left populist strategy are not possible within the really existing Europe. Okay. On the other side, I don't think that the solution is what we call in France the souverainist. Okay, so we leave the European Union, we go back to the franc, and it's completely illusory that in the present situation of globalization, I mean, you can't possibly fight against neoliberalism only at the national level. You need to be part of a bigger union. And I think that if different European countries are going to be able to fight against neoliberalism, it will only come from, let's say, a form of left populism at the European level. Okay? So, I mean, we can't be in and we can't be out, you know. So, and I've got, in France, my friends are really divided between, and the left in general, between people who believe that it's possible within the European Union to, they say not reform, because reform, but to really profoundly transform, to establish, for instance, I mean, there is a very interesting Belgian politician, Paul Magnet, with the, in fact, is from the Socialist Party, is also the mayor of Charleroi, and is the number one in the for the European election for the Socialist Party, the Walloon Socialist Party in Belgium, and he's got, he really believes that it's possible to act within the European Union and transform the balance of power, but of course not Belgium alone, but to establish, for instance, between different countries. So, but and there is a part of the left in France who also believe that it's. Another one say no. You need to leave the euro. For instance, the question is that, and that's not being an economist, I can't really decide. And the economists, left economists, are divided about that. For instance, in Britain, there is this quite interesting discussion among the left economists. Some of them are arguing that the program that Jeremy Corbyn was defending in for the many, not the few, in his election, could be realized within. I mean, it will not be impeded by the European Union to realize it. Some people said they could have done it. So they say, well, let's stay in Europe and transform it. Others are saying, no, it could not be possible. Who am I to decide? You see, that's why I am torn. I don't know. I mean, I know they are very serious people on both sides, who say So what is clear for me is that leaving the European Union, leaving the euro, and going back, for instance, what in the case of Greece, the position that was defended by sayers of people who left Syriza and created European popular unity, were saying, the Greece should have defaulted, and that was not a solution. First, the Greek people didn't want to leave Europe and things like that, so, and that would have been a disaster. On the other side, it's true that staying in, Tsipras was not able to develop the program, so it's really, it's a Cornelian thing to which I honestly don't have any solution myself.
Maybe this is a good moment to call our second speaker tonight to the podium, and maybe I can just please welcome Peter Pilz. And maybe we can continue at this point. What is the position of Liste Jetzt or of the platform One Europe with regard to this question? Can the European Union be democratized to such an extent that the systematic austerity politics of the EU can be abandoned? Is there a possibility for that?
Sure there is, but it's not very clear who's going to do that. That's the major question. But the question that seems most interesting to me is we're at the verge of losing Europe. At the moment, nobody can say if there will be a European Union within the next 10 years. And we have to raise the question, for the first time in the last 3 or 4 decades, what's the alternative? What might be if there's no European Union anymore? And I don't discuss at this moment if it's more or less neoliberal. It's a very important question, but that's at the moment, and I'm very sorry to say that, not the vital European question. Let's look back 10 or 15 years. If you asked me, and at that time I was also a member of parliament, but of a different party, nobody took ideas seriously like there will be internal guarded borders in Europe. There will be right-wing government that ignore the rule of law. There will be controlled public and private media, controlled by small oligarchies. There is going to be hatred against cultural development, against minorities. There is war at very close to Europe, and you can see zones of war from the center of Europe. And today we have to face governments like the government in Hungary that is starting discussions of how to get back territory from Romania. So if we lose European Union, we might be the old Europe, and the old Europe was the continent of wars. If you look into the last 2,000 years, Europe was the major continent of wars, and it might become this continent again. That's the first major argument we have to think about. The second is, again, if we look to Hungary again, and Austria is not by chance just between France and Hungary. If we look to Hungary again, the dispute between liberalism and democracy has been decided yet for the next years, maybe 10 years, maybe 20 years, in a very democratic way. Popular vote decided that an oligarchy who's xenophobe, who's anti-Semitic, who's talking in terms of war, gains the full power. And it always starts with secret service, police, legal system, and mass media. And now let's look at the left and left-wing parties in Austria. You're the expert for France, but I can say what I can see in Austria and maybe in Germany and a few other European countries. If we don't change, basically we are lost as leftists and as left-wing parties. The right-wing party have an historical advantage of at least 10, 15 years. They started their project with ideas of xenophobia we didn't take very seriously in the beginning. And I remember how we were laughing about the not even dentist, Mr. Strache. We don't laugh anymore. And when we look at our governments today, our government becomes more and more similar to the government in Hungary. There's a great difference to France. Right-wing parties are governing, and they are, you are definitely right, they are not right-wing populist government. There does nothing exist like right-wing populist governments. Right-wing populist governments are populist in the form of communication and mobilization and nothing else. But they are always, in Europe, a combination of right-wing, partly fascist parties, and neoconservative parties. And the key to this success was that the neoconservative parties, which in their core are neoliberal parties, took over the vocabulary of the right-wing parties and their media strategy. But today in Austria, we have watched some further steps of gaining power and taking over political power. And that is taking control over secret service, over police, over taking steps to control. And now it's about media. And those are new oligarchs that are establishing control over the most important media in Austria, Kronenzeitung, Kurier. And now the attack on public TV is being performed, and it might be successful. And what's doing the left in this situation? Talking about itself, as it has learned. Who stands higher moral grounds? Who has more moral integrity? Who can prove that the other is worse in moral terms? That's the problem. Where does the left in Austria have popular answers to the well-known needs of common people? And common people define themselves not as working class, but as people. They call themselves people. And they have needs, they have disappointments, and they have positions. And their positions, the transformations from positions to politics, depend very much on us. And we were not able to answer their questions because we have lost 1 decade, and so we have started at a question we don't like. And that's the question of immigration and not the question of social justice. So if we can't answer questions of immigration, nobody will listen to us when we talk about social justice. So we have to talk about questions like, why does the Ministry of Interior of the Republic of Austria, together with his colleagues in Hungary and Germany, block Frontex so that the police control of the borders of Europe is not going to be started in 2022, but is postponed to 2027? It's a strange question. And for left-wing activists, it seems to be very strange to discuss items like that. But that's exactly what we have to do. Because if you don't have the key to the question of immigration, you can't open the door where people are inside and listen to you about social question, equality, and solidarity. And that's the point. That's no reason to use a single racist term, a single anti-Muslim term. But you have to take the questions very seriously. We have not lost yet, but we have lost so much time that it's very important to make clear. If we don't find a left-wing populist answer, there will be no left-wing answer. And my last argument, we have to solve a completely new question. When the new oligarchs take over the control over the traditional media, we are not strong enough at the moment to fight that back. We can't stand that ground at the moment. We'll do our best, but we will not be able to stand the whole ground. But what we can do is create our own media. We have to do that as a question of political survival, to save the opportunity to become offensive to regain political chances. That's what we can do, and that's why I call myself a left-wing populist, because I know whom we have to address very seriously.
Madame Mouffe, would you like to comment upon Mr. Pilz's statement? Would you like to maybe join us with an advice of how to regain the populist anger?
No. I was thinking when, the question: what has happened to Austrian social democracy? I think that's the basic question, because. If you think of the Kreisky area, I mean, in fact, I wonder if you will agree. I think that in a sense, Kreisky was a left populist. Would you agree with me on that? Yes? Yeah, okay. So, and I think that also, in fact, we tend to make reference to the golden age of social democracy. And I think those golden age, it's got the name like Kreisky or Olof Palme in Sweden. Olof Palme was a left populist also, you know? So I think that the question is I mean, what has happened? Why has this tradition been? What's the moment where you will say that's where we moved away from that? What are there any specific moment that you'll say that is where we live?
In Austria, as far as I can see and as far as I can remember, is when social democracy, like Tony Blair in Great Britain, you mentioned him. Began to be convinced that parts of the major companies are their allies, and they have to win them over, not because they like them, but because there is no alternative. You see, when I remember social democrats from the 80s and 90s as people who didn't see any alternative to the existing economic system. And when you don't know who's your adversary and whom do you stand against, then the only thing is you replace the social agenda of your party by the personal agenda of yourself and your friends within the party.
Well, maybe, yeah.
One thing that maybe some of you were there. Yesterday I went to hear Danny Roderick giving a lecture at the ORF Radio Culturos. And it was, well, he did not use the term left populism, but he was defending it. I thought that was really interesting because this is a well-known economist from Harvard, and which is, not progressive, but, and he was examining, in fact, that also can help us to understand what's happened. He was, of course, he did it from an economic point of view, trying to see what he said. He called that the wrong term that was taken with what he called hyper-globalization. So he said that in the 90s, there was the moment in which the term was abandoned. In fact, if there are economists here, it will be interesting to know what they think about that, because he was saying that the kind of regime of the Bretton Woods regime is something that did allow to combine the question of popular sovereignty with mass democracy and capitalism. That's basically what he's saying. There are different forms possible of capitalism, and that the form which was really important during social democracy, which allowed to combine some form of popular sovereignty and mass democracy, is something which the Bretton Woods Agreement allow for that kind of thing. And the fact that they were abandoned later in the system what they call hyper-globalization, that today there is, in fact, a contradiction between this and what he call that mass democracy. But by the way, this is an argument that in fact goes into the same direction of the argument that Wolfgang Streeck is making in book Buying Time, when he said that in fact the moment in which the possibility of combining this hyper-globalized capitalism with democracy, that is, we are at a moment where it's not possible anymore. He say that if we want to save democracy, we need definitively to abandon neoliberalism. For instance, Danny Roderick did not use neoliberalism, he speaks of hyper-globalization. But basically the idea, I think, is the same, that we are at a moment in which, you know, the form of, it was also always an easy alliance between capitalism and democracy, no? But it was possible to balance, and today this is not possible anymore. You know, in fact, if we go on with the development of neoliberalism and hyper-globalization, what we need to the question of democracy is well, this already we are in post-democracy. So I think that's also interesting to see that. And he was in fact insisting that he speak of the what he called the form of economic populism, but economic populism, understood by that, taking account of, because he differentiates between economic populism and political populism. For him, political populism is an understanding of populism which is basically based on question of identities, you know, the definition of identities, without really taking account of the economic relation of power. So try to mobilize people on the question of identities, you know, and a form of nationalism, and not really addressing what is at the origin of many of the demand of the people, which is their economic condition, the fact that they are no suffering from the effect of neoliberal globalization. And I wonder, for instance, if in Austria, we also can see the moment in which the popular classes, or let's put it differently, the SPE was not able to understand those transformations, and the fact that, well, you were speaking, Peter, of the people, you know, and not the, and yes, I think that the fact that there was not a real understanding of the transformation in which the working class in Austria under the fact of neoliberalism, and that their demands were different. And in fact, the social democracy was not able to address that, to create a discourse. So in fact, it's the right-wing movement which have been able to articulate that to understand. I don't know if you see what I mean, that they've been able to provide a discourse centering precisely on question of more the identity, and not addressing really the economic condition and what needed to be done in order to satisfy the demand of those people. Can you see that in Austria there was also something? Is that one of the failures of the SPE in Austria or not?
How much time do we have? So,
Half an hour.
so no. You see, my neighbor in northern Styria is a small farmer. And like most people in the countryside, in some parts of Vienna, it's the major cities, it's different for very specific reasons that are not different from other major cities. But he's basically not against immigrants, but he's lost major shares of his income within the last 10 years. And the only answer he got who's responsible for that was immigrants, so he's against immigrants. And if his situation changes to the better, he won't be next day a friend of immigrants, but it will not be that important for him anymore. And he will be able to listen to us much more than he's able today. And his problems are not immigrants from Africa or Arabia, but from Hungary. And that's so you can see it's more and more. That's very interesting for low wage work, for working poor. It's getting more and more an inner European question. How do we deal with Hungarian and Polish and Romanian workers who have their own rights? And you see, it was very difficult, not only for social democrats, to understand those new questions. It was difficult for almost everybody. But the problem was not that the left wouldn't have been able to find question, but they forbade the questions themselves. They said, don't raise those questions are immoral. And that's the problem.
Yeah, I agree totally. And I think that the political questions are not moral questions. They, of course, they've got a dimension. And I usually, for instance, I think that we should remember something that Max Weber said, that a politician needs to combine the ethic of responsibility with the ethic of conviction. And I think it means that, of course, conviction, but the ethic of responsibility. You also need to understand what are the concerns. And I think that, and I agree with you completely on that, the left has become, some kind of moralistic left, treating the political issue. No, they are moral issue, and there is no way. And if you if you pose the question, for instance, Jean-Luc Mélenchon has got a lot of problem in France precisely with this kind of left, because they say that his position on immigration is not clear enough because it's not open borders. To be clear, to open borders. Which I think is absolutely ridiculous from the part of the left, because in fact this is also the ideal of neoliberalism. They want a world when there will be no restriction for capital to move and for people to move, and of course there will be no place more where people can exercise their democratic rights, So, but there is a type of left who in fact plays completely in the game of neoliberalism by forbidding asking those kind of questions. I agree with you completely on that.
I think this is a good moment now to enter a public discussion. Do we already have questions in the audience? Yes? Please.
Yes. My first question is about Jean-Luc Mélenchon. You have spoken about him, and I think so. He, for France, he won the battle against Le Pen, and but now to the vote of the European Parliament, he said, this voting is only a voting for the people who go to the university or more who have more have more education, and I think so. There, it's a bit not. It's not. There is no dialogue with the popular classes. I think so, because he said this.
Well, honestly, I don't have an idea to what you are making reference, because I can imagine that it depends how you interpret that. He might probably have said, and that's true, that the people who basically vote in the European election are the middle class, and that popular classes are not mobilized. He might, you need to have a difference between something saying, okay, this is the situation. It's certainly more than saying that in a normative way, that those elections, are basically for, but the fact that this is how they are perceived by people. But in fact, La France Insoumise today is very much active in the struggle for the European election, and they've got a very good team, and Marion Aubry, which is the lead candidate, she's very good. She's also extremely good on question of ecology, and they are very active. They are doing a very, very active campaign, precisely trying to bring the popular classes to be interested. So I suppose you might misinterpret something that he said. He might have said that today the problem is that only those classes vote, but he's not saying that this is a good thing. It's basically, at least according to what I see of the campaign, and it's a very, very active campaign, is precisely trying to bring all those people into and being them interested in the European election.
Okay, wir haben eine Frage ganz hinten im Raum.
Yeah, erstmal, no, English. Thank you very much for the talks. It was very interesting, very inspiring. And I have a thought on what Mr. Pilz said before, that immigration is the central or the key question to be tackled in order to go on and talk about like real leftist issues afterwards. Because honestly, I think that this is actually the problem, that those questions have for way too long have been the main subject, and that the left has always tried to distance themselves from the views of the right and not talk about their own issues. A few days ago, Kevin Kühnert from the Young Socialists in Germany raised the question of the communalization of big companies like BMW, and the liberal media in Germany, like every newspaper from left to center to right, reported on this, and this was a change in a small change in discourse for 2 days or something, for the first time in ages. And I think that it has to, like, I don't know how to explain it right now in English, but this I think is a very good a very good sign, and we have to get away from those. Because Mr. Pfaller also explained the concept of hegemony again for us, and we have to stop letting the right wing have their high horse in discourse.
I would like to ask you a very simple question, and don't understand me wrong, because basically I see your argument and I share most of it. But today, if you address somebody from the so-called street who's anti-Muslim because he faces such a lot of problem and he doesn't know any answers, and you say, the major companies, they are it. Do you really think he stands up and say, okay, from today on, I love Muslims and I hate transnational companies? It doesn't work like that. But on the other hand, you're definitely right that we have to raise those questions at the same time. You see, the politics of the far right are about enemies and adversaries. The politics of the left are about power and control. It's very different. And we had a moment after the last major financial crisis in Austrian Parliament, where we had a chance to use the Austrian vote to ESM to get something for that. And we discussed it with the Social Democrats, and we said, the least deal we can make in public is a Tobin tax. But then, majority of the Social Democrats and some of my Green friends in Parliament said, no, we can't do that, because we're completely alone. But the decision of the European Union depended on a constitutional majority in Austrian Parliament, and on few votes just of us. And too many of us, Social Democrats and Green, decided just to step back, because they didn't believe that they and we could stand the ground in a conflict with the superpowers, economic and political superpowers of Europe. And that's a completely wrong view. And my colleague from the Young Socialists in Germany in this respect is completely right when he raises those questions. But I'm no friend of the so-called reframing. Let's reframe. When the majority of the working poor discuss immigration, we reframe and replace the discussion by a discussion about social justice. It doesn't work like that. Not at all. So, first of all, you have to learn to listen to ordinary people. Listen. Then you have to ask them, what do you want? And then you can say, we have some proposals, and we have some ideas how to change this and that, and so on, and to make life better for you. And it's possible. And I've been doing that for the last years in beer tents, and it was great fun. Because if you go there, they listen to you, and they love it, that not only right-wing party representatives drink 1, 2, or even 3 beers with them. And that's the point. But the idea of simple reframing doesn't work at all.
Okay. Mhm. Wir haben noch 3 Fragen im Saal. Und wegen der Knappheit der Zeit würde ich bitten, dass Sie sich kurz fassen und dass wir die 3 Fragen zusammenfassen. Bitte, Nushin Aslan wäre die erste hier in der zweiten Reihe.
Concerning what you said, that the left-wing parties should have popular slogans or talk popular words, I'm thinking of Jean Ziegler, the Swiss sociologue, who says one thing which doesn't leave my mind, a sentence. We all are responsible for the children who die because of hunger. We are murderers. What do you think about that?
Yeah, my question is, I was very interested in your statement that earlier voters in France, they talk about their protest to communists, and now they've changed to Le Pen. And I think there is a lot of answers for women from the left side of the parties. There is no answers for men, I would say. And they are, in my opinion, the losers of any of the developing that is very necessary. But there has to be left-wing answers for men, because if we don't do that, we lose them to the right wings, and we already lost them in a way. So there has to be a man or male policy from the left-wing side, and I would like to hear your opinion about that.
Ja, dann haben wir noch eine Frage ganz vorne, Kollege in der ersten Reihe.
Okay, thanks for the attention. So, how progressive do you consider the new progressive left when all the progression consists of censoring and banning opinions and words?
Ja.
It's not such an easy question. No, let me try to answer a few questions together. And let me come to a different point that's also very important for me. You see, when the left, not only in Austria, doesn't stop thinking the whole time about itself, then we're lost. I try to argue that. Second thing is, what's the perspective? And that's very important for me. You see, when we saw so many surprising changes within the last 10 or 15 years. The only thing we can be sure about is that we are going to see even more surprising changes within the next 15 years. I'm quite sure about that. The dilemma of the nationalist governments, not movements, but governments, is that more and more they're going to lose their internal enemies because they get rid of them. So, but at the same time, those governments are not successful in economic, at least in economic terms. So they have to rely on politics of escalation. And if you can't escalate in your own country, you have to do it abroad. And that's what I'm afraid in the region, let's say, Eastern Hungary, Romania, and you can replace this region by a few more, most of them in the so-called dark middle and east of Europe. But what are the prospects of the left? If we can't change, and if we can't restart the left in a left-wing populist way, I'm quite sure we're not going to play any major role within the last 10 or 15 years. This will be Europe without a significant left. The problem can't be solved by social democracy. Because the only path in the future that seems to be quite clear is the path of social democracy. They are not ready for change, they're not able to change, and they will go down and down and down. Every development, with the exception of the extreme right, is slower in Austria. But I'm quite sure it will come. And then we have to think, then we have to raise one last question. What is if we lose Europe? And my personal answer is, if we lose Europe, the whole world loses Europe. Because Europe in political sense is no continent. Europe is the place where this system, this combination of human rights, of social security came later, but of human rights, of the rule of law, and of democratic rules have been developed for the first and only time. And 10 years ago, until 10 years ago, we all were deeply convinced that we are going to export this model more and more and more and more. And the whole world is going to be more or less a very nicely colored Europe. So that's the point. And what I'm really afraid, and we have to look ourselves and we have to scrutinize left-wing parties. For the first time since Second World War, we have the chance to lose Europe. And that's for me personally, the most important question that has to be answered by the left. If the left can't answer this question, we have lost much more than the influence of left-wing parties. That's what it is about at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Madame Mouffe. Would you like to address one of these
further question
questions?
about, I do agree with John Ziegler, except that, I think that it's not a question to go and say to people, you are responsible, you are a murderer, you know. I think that what's important is some kind of education. And in fact, in my paper, but I cut part because I thought originally it more than, I make reference to the fact that the kind of project that, you know, left populist strategy must develop will require what Gramsci called an intellectual and moral reform, you know. It's because it put into question our whole model of development, our whole productivist model. And I think that for too long, we in Europe have been, you know, having rather good standard of living on the back of what was called at that moment the third world, you know. And I think, for instance, there's something I'm particularly passionate about, is a critique of free trade, because I think that's one of the points in which the left, I don't know, free trade is good. No, free trade is bad. Free trade is bad for us, it's bad for the countries, because it's a long, I don't have time to explain, but you know, I think that we need to put into question this idea. We need to develop a mode of development which is more, you know, for instance, I defend the idea of food sovereignty, of the fact that, in fact, the whole ecological project is very much linked, you know, to a transformation of our mode of life, and in order to not go on creating conditions in which, you know, the cost of our welfare is the exploitation and the thing of the you know, those young the children that use. So I do agree, but what I'm saying is that how are we going to go about in order to, you know, make people aware? I mean, for instance, I can tell you that already one of the points in which Jean-Luc Mélenchon is very much criticized by the moralistic left is when he says that, you know, people don't, because one of the view is that people are normally nomadic, you know, they should be able to, it's part of the human nature to be nomadic, and one should, liberty mean that we should not put that into question. And in fact, Jean-Luc Mélenchon said, well, most of the people in sub-Saharan Africa, they would rather go and stay when they are and really, you know, be able to live in decent conditions. But it's not possible because we are responsible for that. And the European Union, by the way, the agricultural policy and insistence on export and agribusiness is a way in which does contribute to that situation. And so Jean-Luc Mélenchon is criticized for saying we need also, you know, when we deal with the question of immigration, we need to know why those people immigrate, and couldn't we transform the conditions? So I think that it's a very important issue, and we need really to be taken into account of this view. The other question, honestly, I'm not quite sure what you are asking, because I do agree with, you say that the left needs to have policies, but I agree with that. But so what will you want me to say? Do you want me to say what kind of policies? Or I wasn't quite sure where your question was going.
The question is, do the left-wing parties really give answers for men developing? They give a lot of answers for female developing and their possibilities, but they don't give any answers for boy. Thank you for boy. For the school developing of boys, for example, for the developing in the progress of divorces and paying of what's the name in English? Yeah, now I have to change to German. To Alimente, yeah, Zahlungen. I think this is a thing that the state aliments. I don't know. Alimente.
Do you understand the question? Because I don't understand the question.
There should be answers for men from the left-wing side of the parties. Yeah, if you increase children, girls and boys, this is something the state should support, and not just the parents. Then there would be a very different situation, for example, after divorcing, because I think this is really a problem for men in the moment. For example.
Look,
For example,
look,
and I have a lot of them. Thank you.
Well, no, honestly, I don't have any answer to that question because I think that, well, first, I do not think that you seems to imply that we are at a moment in which, the interests of men are not, it's some kind of, feminist revolution which is done at the cost of the interests of men. Well, of course, the advances of feminism is something which can be very, inconvenient consequences for men, and I can see that. But on the other side, I think it's also very important to fight for equality between men and women, and we are in relation of power need to be transformed, and of course there's going to be loss for some people. So I think, let's say, I don't want to enter into particular detail of what the state should do, but my answer in general is that, we are at a moment where, there is an advance of feminism, and this is beginning to be resisted. For instance, it's very interesting to see that the case of Vox in Spain, it's a very, very, it's really a movement which, well, of course, it's not only that, because there is also the Catalonia aspect, but there is profoundly a reaction of men against the advances of feminism, and they want, in fact, to suppress all the advances. They want to abortion and things like that. So we are, this is a moment, but when you've got relation of power which are at stake, and transform, of course, this is something which is not easy and which is going to be reaction. But and I understand that some people, but men has been dominant for such a long time that I think it's really time for women to.
Well, maybe to repoliticize the question, I would just maybe add one thought, that men who are the key losers of the current situations are not losers because of the profits of women, but men are losers due to the liberalizations made by neoliberal politics. So I think that would be the issue to tackle here. So, So I have the very sad duty to close this session for tonight. The only comfort I can offer is the comfort that has given by the famous Tante Jolesch, that you may know from the novel by Friedrich Thorberg, and things that are good appear good only because they always are a little bit too little. So of course we have discussed too little, but at least we have discussed a little bit. And thank you very much, Madame Mouffe, for your inspiring and passionate contribution. Very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Peter Pilz, for your readiness to bring all this back to the current political situation. Thank you for the audience for all your attention and for following us through this series of lectures. The lectures that you have missed, you can all find them on YouTube. Please just insert the names of the lecturers and you will find them. And maybe we see each other on 15th of May with the Gilets Jaunes representative, and hopefully we see each other also again in autumn when the lecture series Talk Europe will continue. All informations are to be found on www.talkeurope.info. Thank you very much. Hope to see you again. Thank you.